embellishing tones. These consist of non-chord tones that help us create a more musical phrase by allowing us to do things such as stepping us from one note to another note, going from one note back down quickly to create a nice musical phrase, and a whole lot more. These non-chord tones are not always non-harmonic notes. Sometimes a non-chord tone will still be in harmony with a different note or notes that are in the chord. Okay, so what is a chord tone? A chord tone is a note that is found in the chord of a note or a chord being played at the moment. So if I have a C chord or if I have a C note, my chord tones are still going to be the notes that are attributed to that note's chords, or if I'm in that chord, it's just those notes in the chord. I'm going to explain what those are. So oftentimes in a song, this is going to change throughout it. Oftentimes single notes can be thought of in context of a chord, and chords are often built horizontally instead of vertically, which is good to keep in mind when analyzing or composing music. These chord tones are thought to be the triads built from each note plugged into the diatonic notes of the scale. For example, if we take the note C, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B. For example, if we are in the key of C, and as you see, I only wrote C here because a lot of times in music it says, okay, it's in the key of C, that means C major. And because we're in the key of C major, that's the C major scale right here. Any triad can be built by counting from the starting note and counting every other note and doing that 2 times. For example, if we have F, A, C, originally we had F, G, A, B, C, and all we did was we skipped every other note from the note that we started on. Furthermore, the 7 can be thought of a chord tone as well, but anything past that would be considered an upper extension. Usually, I will be using the 3 and the 5 as chord tones, especially when thinking in terms of stricter styles of music, such as strict counterpoint, because the 7th is typically looked at as a dissonance. Okay, so the first embellishing tone is known as a passing tone. This is a tone that creates a stepwise motion between 2 chord tones. Oftentimes is composed unaccented. Usually the order is chord tone, passing tone, chord tone. It is also possible to use 2 passing tones to fill the interval of a 4th rather than a 3rd. So let's first go over a regular passing tone. So let's say I'm using a C and I'm doing a C major triad. So if I get a C major triad and then I just take the first 2 notes and I just get C and E, I have my major 3rd. So to get from my C to my E, I could put a D in the middle of that. And because all those notes are still in my key, this is known as a passing tone, because I'm still using notes that are in the key that I'm using, but they're not sounding the chord at the time. So at the time, let's say at the same time I had a perfect 5th of a C over here just sort of playing, and then I was thinking, okay, well with that perfect 5th, now I want to go C to E, because that would sound nice, but now I want to do C to E. And as you can see, if I'm thinking in context of my C chord, that D note would be a major 2nd, so that would sort of be a dissonance, especially in terms of a C major chord. If I randomly just played the D with it, it doesn't quite sound very good, but it sounds good when I do the C and also the E. So the note in the middle of it causes what is known as a dissonance, which makes a unstable sound, which then stabilizes back to the stable sound of the chord tones harmonizing with the chord that's sounding at the moment. So then I also said we could use 2 passing tones to fill in the interval of a 4th rather than a 3rd. So let's say I had a 4th and I just had C and F, so I'm creating my perfect 4th, and let's just say in this case there's just C ringing out in the bass. So then in this case I'm going to use my 2 passing tones to go from C to F, and I'm just going to So as you see, it just created a stepwise motion which went through the notes that are in our key, taking us to the next note. Stepwise motion can be very nice to the listener because it doesn't just sound like one note going to the next note. It sort of sounds like one note drifting into the next note. Next, there is a neighbor tone, which creates a bump in the tone. This is also found between two chord tones. Yet this time, the two chord tones are the same note, and the neighbor tone just goes above or below the middle of that chord tone. So for example, if we're taking the note G, and we want to do a neighbor tone to G, then we could do G, A, G to go above, or we could go G, F, G if we want to go below. This has the effect of decorating a single chord tone note. Okay, so below we actually have some variations of neighboring notes. We have the double neighbor note. This wraps around the single chord tone. Double neighbor tones can be written in either direction, above than below or below than above. So for example, we have C, D, B, C. The D and B are both neighboring notes, but played in succession, and therefore are known as double neighboring notes. So as you see, it wraps around the note, but it goes to two neighboring notes before it lands back on the regular note. So in other words, in chord tones, it's sort of creating a dissonance between the chord tone at the moment twice, and then landing back and settling with the consonants back from where it started. So in this case, we'll call it C. So we'll have C ringing in the bass at the time, and we're just going to go C, D, B, and then C. Okay? So it's going to be like this. As you can see, these little things just create nice little musical phrases. And a good little tip here is that when you start developing a motif to a song or a melody, you add these little things and they sort of embellish the song a little more and create some nice phrases out of the material that you already have. The next one is a incomplete neighbor note. This occurs between two different chord tones. It's known as incomplete because it is approached in stepwise motion on one side, but it has a leap on the other side. This causes it to sound like it's creating a neighboring sound between one side, but it doesn't occur on the other side. Usually these are unaccented. Most of the time, incomplete neighboring notes are accompanied by a leap and then are resolved by a step afterwards. This is considered incomplete because there is only one actual neighboring note and the other form of motion is a leap. Okay, so for example, if I have G and I want to go to E and I have G ringing in the bass at the time, and if I go G, D, and then E, as you can see, it leaps up from G to D, making a perfect fifth, but then it goes right to E just with a stepwise motion. So let's listen to what that would kind of sound like. So as you could hear, it leaped up and then it sort of just merged into the next note. Okay, so I want to go from G down to E. Let's say I have E ringing in the bass at the moment. So for the incomplete neighboring tone, if I'm going from G to my E, I'm going to instead go down a leap and then go back to my E. So this is a descending incomplete neighboring tone, just to throw in something to think about a little more here. So I have a G, down to D, and then E. I'm going to be doing that at the same time as my bass is ringing in my E. So the first note harmonized with a chord tone with that bass note. Then that second note did a leap and it did a non-harmonious note to the chord at the time, and then it went up and actually did just a harmonization of an octave, landing with two E's. So just to conclude that, again, just to really get this in our head, it's good to kind of listen to things multiple times, hear it multiple times, write it down, practice it multiple times to really get these things in your brain so you remember them. So the first note leaps to the second note, and the second note uses a neighboring tone to ascend up to the third note. Since the neighbor note is not technically a neighbor note of both of the chord tones it is surrounding, it is considered an incomplete neighboring note. It is good to keep in mind that generally a leap is resolved in stepwise motion in the opposite direction from the direction that it leaped from. This is important to contrapuntal compositions following strict counterpoint. Below consist of some variations of an incomplete neighboring tone. First, we have the appoggiatura. This is an accented neighboring tone that is approached by a leap and then resolved up or down a step in the opposite direction to the chord tone. The difference between this and an accented passing tone is that a passing tone is a non-chord tone approached by a step and then is resolved by a step, while an appoggiatura is a non-chord tone that is approached by a leap and then resolved by a step in the opposite direction. So if it is approached by an ascending leap, it resolves down a step. Furthermore, if it is approached by a descending leap, it resolves up a step. So for example, A to C, you'd have A, D, C. So we have A, C. So what would happen is you'd hear the D playing quickly before the C on the beat. So the A leaps up a fourth to D, then the D resolves down a step to C. The D is the appoggiatura of the C. Next we have escape tones. This is a reversed version of the typical incomplete neighboring tone. This is approached by a step and then leaps. The step and the leap move in opposite direction. Usually this is a step up and then a leap down. Like incomplete neighboring notes, these are unaccented. So the sound of that escape tone would be something sort of like if I went from C down to B and then I went back up to E. So my C and my E are chord tones, but my B is not. So I go from C so my first note goes in stepwise motion to my second note, which is a non-chord tone, but then that leaps in the opposite direction to a chord tone. Anticipation, a stable tone that arrives earlier than one would expect. This often happens directly before a change of harmony. The note will be repeated if arriving at an expected chord. This is unaccented. This is also a type of syncopation. In simple terms, syncopation is a note that is off the beat. This takes an unaccented beat or even upbeat and puts an accented note there. In order to be syncopation, it must be either anticipation or suspension. Anticipation would be an accented note or unaccented beat arriving suddenly before one would expect, given the context of the song. Suspension of syncopated rhythms would be an accented note on either an unaccented beat or even an upbeat that arrives later than one would expect. However, suspension in context of Baroque and classical music is more strict and follows set rules in order to be considered a suspension. These mandatory 3 rules are prepare, suspend, and resolve, which is also known as PSR. So here we have a P and an S, and we have 2 notes that are going to be the same note. Okay, so if I have my prepare and my suspend notes, let's say it's D, I'm going to be using the same notes for both. So it's going to be, that's my prepare and my suspend. And when S moves to R, we have to resolve by a step, usually downward. So we'd have D, D, C. And how is this a suspension? Well, it's because it's in context of working harmoniously over a bass line or a chord. Okay, so let's say the bass is playing a G chord or note at the moment. In this case, I'll just do a G note. Okay? And then while that G is playing, I'm going to have my D, which is going to create a perfect fifth, so it is going to be in harmony. But then I'm going to keep playing that D, again remember, a second time. But this time when I hit that D, I'm actually going to land my bass on C. So again, the first time I'm playing this D, I'm going to be playing G and D, and then I'm going to keep playing D, but then I'm going to go C and D, which creates a major second, which depending on your ear can be thought of as a dissonance. Okay, I'm going to play that D twice, and then I'm going to go down to my C. And what's going on here is in the bass, I'm going to do that same thing where I go from my G the first time, and then I go to C my second time. But now I'm going to stay on my C when my other note goes from my D down to my C, which is going to create an octave of both of those and create a nice sound. So the first time what happened there was I played my G and my D, creating that perfect fifth, a nice little harmony. And then I played my D again, but I went down to a C, creating a not so nice dissonance. Then from there, I kept playing my C in the bass, but then I went down a step to my C, creating a nice octave consonance. So let's kind of hear what that would sound like. So as you might have heard, the first time they harmonized nicely, the second time it kind of mixed not so nice, and then the third time it mixed nice again, resolving that. So what happened was that D was suspended. It hung over from my G, and it was still ringing when I went to my C. And then when I went to my C again, now I went down a step, resolving that sort of sound. So it's sort of like D is hanging over the chord tone position that it would normally be in, and it hangs over into the next chord. So it's going G, D, and then it's hanging over into C. It's D is still here, but now we're in C. And then the next time now we're going C. Okay, now we're in C. So it's sort of hanging over from it's like still left over from the past chord we were using, and then it's sort of merging into an actual chord tone since it goes up or down a step to resolve into a chord tone. So to kind of go over that one more time, the P note is going to belong to the chord that is playing at the moment, or prepare. So the R note, the resolve note, will also belong to the chord that is playing at the moment, but the difference is that it will be a different chord than we had at P. And the S will be a dissonant note of the chord being played at the time. As you saw in my example, the S and the R, the suspend and the resolve, steps 2 and 3, can share the same chord, but the S must be a dissonant note of the chord being played at the moment, and the S must be the same note as P. If the suspension is not prepared, it would be considered an appoggiatura because we would leap from a chord tone to a non-chord tone. Then we would resolve that non-chord tone by moving a step in the opposite direction from the leap to a chord tone. That is what an appoggiatura is. Okay, double suspensions are also a possibility and have been used in popular music such as J.S. Bach. We can form a suspension in an upper voice as well as a lower voice in counterpoint. If we move in harmony, this can be nice. But when trying to achieve polyphony, where multiple melodies are being heard as dominating, there would be a completely different approach from the method one would use in harmony. Harmony in melody is where there is a dominating voice, the melody, and then there's a harmony accompanying that. While in counterpoint, you're going to have two different voices that are both dominating, and you're both hearing them as the dominant voice. There's not one voice accompanying another. They're both their own voices playing their own separate melodies. And because of this, this is going to be in terms of counterpoint and not harmony. Okay, so for example, in my bass, I'm going to have the note G, and then in my alto, I'm going to have the note D, and then in my soprano, I'm going to have the note B. Okay? And from these notes, I'm going to suspend my D and my B, both of them, in the alto and the soprano. So I'm going to start with G, D, and B, and then I'm going to go over to C in my bass, but I'm going to keep staying on that D and B in my alto and my soprano. And that creates a dissonance right there, and it sounds kind of unresolved or dissonant. So now look at this. Now I go stepwise motion in contrary motion in both my alto and my soprano. So in my alto, I go down in stepwise motion. In my soprano, I go up in stepwise motion. So we are not only suspending, but we are suspending, and then we are creating a resolution of contrary motion to create 3 octaves. Okay, so to kind of hear what that would sound like, it's going to sound something kind of like this. So there's a double suspension. Since this is a double suspension, we got to analyze it twice. So the soprano has a P and an S of B. As you can see, the soprano has a prepare and a suspend of B. This creates a major 10th with G in the first step. So we have a major 10th, which is actually known as a consonance. And then C to B creates a dissonant major 7th in the second step. So in the second step, we have that C to that B, and now we have a dissonant major 7th. Then B finally resolves up a step to C, creating a consonant 8 or octave between the bass and the soprano in the third step. This is called a 7/8 suspension because there is the dissonant 7 resolving to a consonant 8. So as you see, that's creating a 7, that's creating an 8, so that's known as a 7/8 suspension. Okay, so the P and the S of the alto are also D, which creates a consonant perfect 5th in the first step. Then C and D create a dissonant compound major 2nd, also known as a major 9th in the second step. Then finally, D in the alto resolves down a step to C, creating a consonant octave between the bass and the alto in the third step. So this would be called a 9/8 suspension because of the dissonant 9 resolving to the consonant 8. So it might be kind of confusing because let's talk about the octave just for example. I'm calling this relationship an octave, which I'm calling an 8, and I'm also calling this relationship an octave, which I'm also calling an 8. But you might think, why don't I call it a 16 then if I'm going up those 16 notes? Well, that would just kind of make things confusing, and they're the same note, they're both C, so they're still going to function the same. So I'm just going to call it in correlation to what it is and the scale degrees. So it's an octave of the scale degree that we're using, but instead of calling it 2 octaves up, I'm just going to call it an 8. So just kind of talk about that a little more. I'm already calling C in the alto 8, which is an octave above the soprano, okay? So technically, the soprano C would be 2 octaves above this bass C. But that would make the intervals of the other notes that we're using before all of this a lot more confusing to label and understand. The notes have the same diatonic function in the scale, they're just different octaves. Additionally, the soprano and the alto move in contrary motion to each other but still follow the guidelines for suspension. This creates a contrapuntal double suspension. Oh, this is just great.